Good morning. I'm Glenn Lowry, Director of the Museum of Modern Art, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this conversation that follows the press preview for Toward a Concrete Utopia, Architecture in Yugoslavia, 1948 to 1980, co-curated by Martino Stierli, Chief Curator of Architecture and Design here at the Museum of Modern Art, and Vladimir Kulić, who is with us, and we are so grateful for your participation in this project. This is one of these fascinating, all-encompassing efforts that included a host of people, including Vladimir, who's the Associate Professor, School of Architecture at Florida Atlantic University. So welcome to these cooler climes up north. Barely. Just joking. I want to also thank Anna Katz, Curatorial Assistant here at the Museum of Modern Art, and Theodosius Isaias, Museum Research Consortium Fellow. We also had a 12-month architecture and design intern on the project, Joanna Heitor. They were incredibly helpful. They provided the kind of backbone that enabled this project to be so successful. And we're also grateful to the many other people from literally many corners of the world, as well as here in New York, who helped us put this project in play. Sponsors, of course, are always important, and major support for this exhibition is provided by our own International Council and Contemporary Arts Council, but also very generous funding from the Grand Foundation, as well as from the museum's annual exhibition fund. The publication, I hope you've all seen, it's very beautiful, was supported by the Joe Carroll Lauder Publications Fund of the International Council here at the Museum of Modern Art. So with that out of the way, let's dive into this fantastic and interesting exhibition. I want to begin, Martino, with you and walk us backwards towards the conception of the show and why you wanted to focus on this moment in Yugoslavia.
Yes, I mean, I think it came probably as a big surprise to everyone. It's my first big MoMA show since I started 3 years ago. Basically, a lot of my time since then has been devoted to that project. There were two things that I was interested in exploring. One was maybe more an aesthetic side. I was fascinated by the richness and the abundance and the high quality of many of the things that are on view that is Yugoslavia produced in the post-war period, which I came to see as really on equal par with anything that was built in the post-war period anywhere. It's completely an unknown chapter of architectural history, and I think one of the duties of our curatorial generation is to critically reassess the canon of architectural and art history, how it has been established, not the least by major exhibitions at MoMA. And I think, for example, an exhibition such as Latin American Construction 3 years ago led really the way into such a critical reevaluation. I think our project Toward a Concrete Utopia is taking that notion one step further and really looks at a part of the world that, of course, because of Cold War politics and alliances, just was not seen the way it should have seen. So that's maybe the aesthetic and historical point of view. I think there's also a sociological question that I was really interested in exploring. I notice more and more with great concern that architecture in our part of the world is more and more becoming a luxury commodity for glossy magazines. And I think architecture as a discipline, as a contribution to cultural production can only really thrive if it is part of a larger social project. And I think Yugoslavia, in an exemplary way, shows how architecture was employed and could be employed for the building or for the construction of a utopian project of a society that socialist Yugoslavia really was essentially about.
Before we come back to the issues of a utopian society, Vladimir, one of the things that really struck me, and I'm sure everyone else about this exhibition, is the abundance of incredibly interesting, rich material. Given the turmoil that followed Yugoslavia's breaking apart, where is this material preserved and how is it understood as archivally important. Do you want to talk a little bit about the richness of this material and how it has survived?
Yes, absolutely. I'm going to tell an anecdote now.
Please.
Very long time ago, almost 15 years ago, when I was still a graduate student in Texas, I wrote can't even remember, some kind of grant proposal in which I wrote that Yugoslavia was a gold mine for architectural historians. And then I was slammed, saying that it's an opportunistic statement that no one is going to believe. And in some ways, what you just said, I'm very happy actually confirms what I kind of tried to write 15 years ago. And I think one of the defining features of what was produced in Yugoslavia was this radical diversity of experiments with architecture on every possible level, from the level of organization of space, from the level of engagement with technologies and materials, down to aesthetic level, right? To various kind of aesthetic experiments, with reinterpretations of regional architecture, et cetera, and the density of these experiments is something that's rather unparalleled. I think there is, we find other really interesting architecture scenes across the world at the time, right? 50s, 60s, 70s, that were in some ways more consistent, right? Which allowed them to be much more easily branded. And with Yugoslavia, that's very elusive, right? It's whichever way you try to kind of brand it, something falls out and doesn't allow you to kind of create a consistent picture. But from today's perspective, I really think that diversity, that enormous richness is precisely something that is absolutely fascinating and worthwhile exploring. Archivally, the show is, I think, really a game changer for the entire region because we are showing material that much of the material that was never seen, in many instances, material that we never thought ever survived, right? Because of the series of wars that occurred in the 1990s. Of course, a lot of archival material disappeared in war destructions. A lot of archival material disappeared in the kind of the transition towards capitalism, where large firms were privatized and archives were simply thrown into trash as something unvaluable. But then a number of things have emerged here for this exhibition in New York that are absolutely fascinating, right? Perhaps I think the biggest find is and I'm very happy to see Tatiana Neidhardt actually coming, the daughter of Jure Neidhardt, one of the most prominent architects that we're featuring in an entire room, and she managed to save her father's segment of her father's archive through the siege of Sarajevo with 3 boxes, and I'm incredibly excited that we're being able to show that.
It seems to come back now to this issue of utopic visions. It seems to me there are 2 axes that cut across the entire exhibition. One is a kind of utopian dystopian tension, and the other one is the universalism of socialism as a project and the extraordinary survival of regional voices. And so let's talk about how these different axes define architecture in Yugoslavia during this period. Martino, you want to talk about the utopian vision and the dystopic tensions that undergird it?
Yes, that's obviously, I think, a very driving force, a dialectical force that is underlying this project. And I think one is one of the aspects of this dialectic is, of course, the temporal axis. I mean, there is the legacy of that architectural production, but there's also what's left of it. Many of the buildings that we are showing actually continue to be in use, and very successfully so. Others, however, and mainly many of the monuments that were commemorating the anti-fascist struggle in World War II and concentration camps, killing fields that happened in World War II, which became sort of the foundational myth of the new society. And so that, of course, is already sort of kind of a dystopian foundational myth, but it's exacerbated by the neglect that some of these models have suffered since the nationalist rise and the falling apart of Yugoslavia into independent nation states. And I think that is very, that dystopian side maybe of the utopian project is very beautifully visualized in the stunning photographs by Valentin Jeck, who's also here with us this morning, commissioned work, which I think give us a very good understanding of the factor of time and of temporality. One could also say, of course, that modernity and modernization is in itself a traumatic experience. It basically means the transformation of rural, local, closed society into highly mobile, urbanized, industrialized societies. And that, of course, is a traumatic experience that is not unique to Yugoslavia or to any socialist project. It's just very interesting, of course, that Yugoslavia underwent that change or that transformation relatively late, after World War II, really, and in a very, very, very fast manner. And that, of course, is also the utopian side. There is this great moment of the belief of progress, in progress, and also in belief to be able to transform to society. But of course, like every such project, there are casualties.
Do you want to talk about the tension between the universalizing aspects of socialism and the survival, even the articulation of regional identity, Vladimir?
Actually, I'm not sure whether tension is the term, because that was the founding block of Yugoslavia, right? The universalizing project of modernization of socialism and of federal states, articulated through federal state, and then a very deliberate attempt actually to preserve these various ethnic identities in all kinds of ways. That's actually what's also really fascinating, that these various ethnic identities were articulated in very, very different ways. So there was not even a kind of prescribed recipe for relationship to traditional past. Yugoslavia was, and that's what I think is also really interesting for us from today's perspective, right? Yugoslavia was an intensely multi-ethnic but also multicultural society, and that articulation of multiculturalism was really quite fascinating. A federation of 6 republics that were sort of formed as nation states, but also many other ethnicities that were embedded within the country, and the goal, at least the kind of the ideal model, right? The ideal goal was to allow self-expression to these constituent groups that formed Yugoslavia. And we see an emergence on the architectural terms. We see the emergence of architecture schools in these different parts of Yugoslavia, which were formed in some instances on very strong terms, precisely with the goal to articulate some kind of national, ethnic identity, very often centered on particular very strong figures. Some of the architects that we are highlighting through the monographic rooms in the exhibition were formative figures in that respect. For example, in Slovenia, Edvard Ravnikar was I was absolutely astounded when I found out that he had over, I believe, 600 graduates who did thesis with him, right? Because this is really, really a formative figure. But whoever also was able to sort of impart a very particular way of dealing with architecture that was built on the traditional Central European modernism, dating back to Otto Wagner in Vienna through his teacher Jože Plečnik, etc., and to create a very clearly profiled yet very rich architecture culture that in many ways still survives in Slovenia. And we see examples like that. You're a Neidhart in Bosnia, for example, who tried to forge a very particular regionalism for Bosnia. We see examples like that scattered throughout the country. That, however, does not mean that Yugoslavia was really just a collection of these disparate, isolated identity projects. There was a great deal of interaction between different parts of the countries, in some ways instituted through the institution of the architecture competition. So we see architects being mobile throughout the country and being able to contribute to the increasing mix of the architecture culture through the exchanges between different parts. So the dialectic, right? Rather than tension, I think the dialectic is perhaps a more precise term between unity of Yugoslavia and these specific schools, specific identities is really a fascinating topic that I really hope that the show will highlight in some ways.
I think the show does it brilliantly, in fact. The reason I use tension rather than dialectic is that perhaps I was being proleptic, because at the end of the day, as an experiment, it failed, right? It blew apart at the seams, dramatically and tragically. And so I was wondering whether that explosion, that was a political and social and explosion and a human catastrophe at a very granular level, wasn't embedded in the survival, even the propagation of this kind of regional ethnic identity that never was able to fully conform to the universalism of a centered state. And so I asked the question really to provoke a reaction, not that that's necessarily the right way to read it.
Yes, well, this project of federalism was actually a reaction to the previous failed project of creating a unitary Yugoslavia, which also exploded or imploded at the beginning of World War II. So now, that might really even, on the one hand, it may force us to ask the question whether, the project of multi-ethnic or forging a single state out of multi-ethnic society is even possible in the 20th century, in the post-imperial era, whatever. On the other hand, I think more interestingly, it forces us to question really the very existence of nation state, right? And which ultimately is always an artificial product, right? So the fact that Yugoslavia did fall apart twice really kind of reveals that kind of fundamentally man-made nature of modern nation states, which in some instances succeed, but in many others actually do not. And we still see those processes happening around the world. However, what I do find fascinating in architecture terms is that these kind of remnants, right, of built environment still bespeak that project in some ways really, really fundamentally and strongly, right? So, and they very interestingly, even though they're dating back to this period of federalism, remain as the icons of these separate ethnic republican national identities, and that dialectic or tension, right, in some ways is still present, even in the independent states that exist today.
So Martino, one of the things that I think is so engaging about the exhibition and about the whole project itself of Yugoslavia is the way in which you've teased out this notion of everyday life and brought design, film, the sort of material culture into the conversation. Would you talk a little bit about the way in which the exhibition in a way surfaces this extraordinary design moment as well as architecture?
Yeah, thank you very much for mentioning that. Actually, also a little anecdote on the design side. Many of you will not know, some of you might remember that back in 1970, one of our predecessors, the great Emilio Ambas, acquired a K67 kiosk by the Slovene designer Sasha Mechtig for the permanent collection of the Museum of Modern Art. Sasha Mechtig is actually maybe even also here in the audience, but he is certainly going to be around later today. The K67 kiosk is a piece of modular street furniture that had a variety of uses, ticket booth, bookstore, you name it, anything that you could basically use this for wherever. The problem was, however, that nobody at MoMA realized how big the damn thing was, and it couldn't fit into the doors. So they had to find a solution, and it was placed on 53rd Street for a while. I think it was, rumor has it that it was used as a hot dog stand. At some point it was given on permanent loan to educational facility in Long Island, and then the traces get lost. We felt it was very important to bring that back to the museum, especially, of course, now that we have doors that are big enough and wide enough. And you will see a beautifully restored exemplar of this really stunning object on the 3rd floor escalator landing, which basically forms the entrance or the welcome to the show. We are also showing many other everyday furniture pieces, mass-produced furniture pieces, electronical appliances such as TVs, microphones, telephones. Many of these objects actually have already been in the collection of the Museum of Modern Art, not least through the tireless efforts of my great esteemed colleague Juliet Kinchin, who has been a champion of Yugoslav and Eastern European design. And there are really stunning things. There's, for example, the Rex folding chair by Niko Kral, another important Slovene designer, which was really a great success. It was marketed by Design Within Reach a few years ago. So this is really a piece of the global legacy of modernist design. And I think what is so fascinating about this section is that it really shows that there is an abundant presence of design culture and mass production in a socialist country. Consumer culture, there's an aspect even of pop culture, I think, in that gallery, which is really very attractive. And I think that is also an aspect that we just tended not to see, because we, tended to think of Eastern Europe and Yugoslavia as, this sad place behind the Iron Curtain, which it wasn't, where everything is grey and doesn't have no pleasure zones. It's a great pleasure zone, I think, the design gallery.
Indeed. So let's turn this over to all of you. If you have questions for Martino or Vladimir, please just raise your hand. The light is bright here, so it's hard for me sometimes to see, but I hope there are some questions. Yes, please, over here. Wait 1 second, we're going to get you a microphone so that everyone can hear.
Hi. Since many of the names in the exhibit of the architects are unfamiliar to American audiences or even to audiences outside of Yugoslavia, there's this part of the exhibit called Global Networks, but I mean, what's exhibited there, some pavilions that were at expos, or some work in Nigeria. I'm just curious about the actual global extent of, the production of these Yugoslavian architects. How far-reaching was it, or is this mainly an exhibit of a place and a time that's very sort of in that moment, in that region?
It's a very important question, and I think there is an essay that I try to sort of elaborate a little bit in the catalog that I would definitely recommend you should consult. The section is really about a two-way street. It's about, on the one hand, how architectural culture in Yugoslavia was informed by a variety of global influences. There is, of course, Kenzo Tange's massive contribution, at least as an idealistic project for the reconstruction of the city center of Skopje. There's this absolutely fabulous model that he produced for the competition that is shown for the first time in the Western world ever. It's a true sensation. There are also, in terms of Skopje, the really important contributions by a group of local architects who were invited by the United States government after the earthquake in Skopje to study for a year or two at leading American universities. Some of them were, working with Paul Rudolph in Yale, with I.M. Pei here in New York. And they brought back this notion of sort of US-American brutalist architecture to Skopje and transformed it into something very unique, also against the canvas of Kenzo Tange's metabolist notion. And then the architectural exports is the other side. So it's not just things that came to Yugoslavia from elsewhere, from all corners of the world, but also how architecture was used as an export to newly independent post-colonial nations, mainly in Africa, with the contribution by the Belgrade firm Energoprojekt, particularly interesting, important for a variety of reasons. So it's a lot to say, and it does deal with many unknown figures, but when you start reading into it, you will be able to tease out many connections with very, very significant and well-known and established figures that are, part of the architectural canon.
Sorry, go ahead. Please.
And if I may add a couple of words, everything that we actually have in that section are stand-ins for much larger stories that exist behind, right? The little display on an project really stands for a much vaster network of exports that went literally throughout what we call today the Global South, from Africa to Middle East to South Asia, all the way to even South America. That is something that the research of has actually only started in the past several years. Archives are really greatly endangered because all of these big firms that were major players on the global scene, many of them have disappeared, others have been privatized, etc., and archives are very questionable. It's difficult to find the material, but it is an incredibly important story that a number of our colleagues, including Dubravka Sekulić, who's one of our curatorial advisors, Luka Stanek, who has written an essay for the catalog, are working on. So in a way, this is see this as a preview, actually, for another kind of great find that we hope this exhibition will kind of bring back to light that has been forgotten for a long time.
I was just going to add that one of the things that I think is so fascinating about this exhibition, but it was also true, but perhaps not as dramatically revelatory about the project we did with Latin America, is that there are many different kinds of globalization that were taking place simultaneously. We have a tendency in Europe and North America to see globalization through a very Eurocentric, North American-centric lens, but the whole non-aligned movement created its own set of networks in the 60s, 70s, 80s in particular, that was all about a redistribution of ideas and a sharing of cultures that reads differently, and that was, in a way, I think, if not erased, occluded by the impact of what happened with economic globalization as a driver in the 90s and early aughts. And so I think one of the values of exhibitions like this is to remind us that there was an awful lot taking place that might have been invisible to us, but it wasn't invisible to the many different countries, groups, architects, schools that participated in this. And so in a way, globalization tends to be an umbrella for some kind of single idea, when in fact we have to think about it as multiple ideas layered together and not always operating simultaneously. And I think this foreshadows that or foregrounds that beautifully. Other questions? Yes, right there, please.
Actually, just to further on the question on the influence between the United States and Yugoslavia, the nature of it from the very beginning after the Second World War, and of course to what Martino is saying, the kind of organized brutalist influence from Yale and Paul Rudolph. But maybe I'm very interested about the earlier nature of kind of taking on the US aesthetics in the use of Yugoslav architecture.
Well, that is actually also part of that essay that I've already pointed out. Very important to say that Yugoslavia breaks with Stalin in 1948, and there's a rapid opening towards the West. United States, and actually Vladimir has written about that in his PhD, thinks that it can get Tito to join the NATO and starts putting massive amounts of money into the development. And there's also a cultural side to that new alliance or emerging alliance, which never really actually completely gets through. But for a couple of years, there is the thought that that might happen. And MoMA, interestingly, plays a not insignificant role in this. MoMA starts sending over important exhibitions on modern American contemporary architecture, to also art, actually, art and architecture. So a variety, a number of exhibitions that were produced here in-house were then sent off to Europe, and many of them also specifically to Yugoslavia. And that established a kind of a reception of the international style of Miesian architecture in Yugoslavia for a few years before then the brutalist sort of wave takes over. So it's a really fascinating story with many interconnected narratives that remain to be explored, but that I try to explore in that essay.
Yes, right there.
The other thing that one remembers, or at least I remember, about Yugoslavia before 1980 is the experiment with the workers' self-control. And I wonder, just in the practice of the architectural firm, did this have any effect? How did it have its effect, and so on?
Yeah, thank you for that question. It's a really incredibly important and yet incredibly complex question that requires answers on multiple levels, and also really a great deal of new research that we're hoping will emerge. Our colleague Mario Mrduljaš, who's here in the first row, wrote the long essay in the catalog on architecture and self-management, where he's addressing this relationship in terms of the functioning of architectural organizations, meaning offices, but also in terms of the design of architecture for a self-managing society, right? So kind of the explanation for those who may not remember this is Yugoslavia. One of the three kind of founding blocks of post-war Yugoslavia was that after 48, the country reworked its social system, discarded the Stalinist centralism, and started developing a lot more decentralized system based on workers, self-managing workers' councils that were supposed to govern factories, as well as ultimately self-management was supposed to be implemented in communities as well, which completely transformed the sources of funding also for architecture as well. And we see an emergence or flourishing of various experiments for various building types that were meant to serve this new self-managed society, whether what was called at the time architecture of the social standard, right, which is all of the social services that were available to citizens more or less for free, which we are featuring an entire gallery room, various educational facilities, etc. Or also in the case of mass housing, which was also a very interesting and kind of difficult to describe a system in constant flux, where state ceased to be the provider of housing, and then actually the system ended up being decentralized between numerous enterprises that contributed to the economy in the country. It's in many ways still a rather intractable question, right? In a way, I really do hope that this exhibition will serve as an impetus for new research, really, that will help us uncover all of the intricacies in the system, which actually in some ways was incredibly productive in the mid-1970s, we see the peak of housing production across Yugoslavia. Only in Belgrade, supposedly, there were 15,000 apartments built every year. And actually just behind you is one of the architects, Milena Marušić, who was one of the architects that contributed to that incredible production of architecture, investing an enormous amount of efforts in defining or experimenting with apartment plans that would, within the limits of social housing, allow you to have spaces that are comfortable, that are attractive, that appear much larger than they are, producing a value that is very specific to that moment and to that place, that is hard to find if you look at housing production in the rest of Eastern Europe. It looks radically different. I've lived in the United States for almost 20 years, and the only place that reminded me of those apartments were apartments designed by Marcel Breuer at the Institute for Advanced Studies in Princeton. That we're talking about that kind of quality. And in many ways, that kind of architecture culture developed for the self-managing society, unfortunately, has ceased to exist. It disappeared. But I do hope that the exhibition will be one of the impetuses to actually go back to and research this body of knowledge that was developed, and perhaps bring it back to life.
We have time for one more question. Yes, thank you.
Hi, I've seen photographs of these kind of monuments, like the one on the screen right now, shared online in kind of like a viral fashion. And I was wondering if you could speak to perhaps how these monuments have captured the imagination and maybe become somewhat like they've taken on a second life, and that's maybe detached from their original purpose and meaning, and if you could speak to that at all.
Well, you rightly point out, I mean, I have to say, I was also susceptible to that fascination on social media, which, you know, prompted my curiosity. It is true that many of these monuments explore a really interesting formal register between figuration and abstraction, and they are out of scale for sort of a more conventional understanding of what a monument could be. And I think that has led to the perception of these objects as some kind of otherworldly, strange things that landed on planet Earth, that, you know, which is of course part of the Orientalist or narrative that the Balkans has historically been subjected to and continues to be. I mean, it's still sort of, you know, seen as a part of the world that is somewhere, you know, a backwater there, and we don't really know what these people do and what they are. However, actually, and I think one of the key objectives that we wanted to reframe this conversation is to show that these monuments were really, really important in the construction of an overarching common history for Yugoslavia, in that they commemorated the anti-fascist struggle of the partisans in World War II, in that they commemorated the many, many thousands of victims of fascism in concentration camps and so on and so forth. Of course, that traumatic experience became somehow the foundational myth of post-war socialist Yugoslavia. And in that sense, these monuments had a very, very specific and important social function. And they produced highly, highly interesting hybrid forms. They weren't just sculptural objects. Many of them transcend, again, the scale of the sculptural objects and become architecture. They are useful buildings that you can experience, that included convention centers and exhibition halls and so on and so forth. Many of them are also part of much larger landscapes, almost anticipating US-American earthworks movement, as it were, really sculpture in the expanded field, as it were, where sculpture is no longer relegated to just a singular object, but is part of a much larger environment, as it were, that can be experienced through space and time. And I think that is what we wanted to highlight with that particular, in that particular chapter of the exhibition.
And if I may add, also highlight the fact that their commemorative function did not cease to be significant with the collapse of socialist Yugoslavia, which is often what you see in these media representations, where the actual commemorative purpose is arguably wiped out, and they're just these pretty objects that stand in landscape, and the events they commemorate are supposedly should be forgotten. So we were very careful of trying to actually bring back the information of what these monuments were devoted to, because, you know, especially today's political moment, the fact that we're dealing with a huge body of work that commemorated anti-fascist struggle, really, you know, we wanted to highlight the fact that kind of the contextualizing and wiping out that history is something really quite problematic.
Thank you, Vladimir. Thank you, Martino. What a fantastic exhibition. We salute you both and your teams for putting this together. Thank you all for joining us.